The film starts in Tikrit during the Iraq War, where an American military crew is positioned at a designated spot. Unexpectedly, a quickly moving vehicle approaches from a distance with its tenants discharging shots. The aggressors are revealed to be a group of Iraqi dissidents who break through the designated spot and continue firing. The leader in command, Sergeant Brandon, orders his soldiers to pursue the assailants. An intense chase unfolds with the soldiers firing at the rebels throughout the town streets. They eventually arrive at a rear entryway, unaware of the potential dangers that lie ahead. The crew leaves their vehicle and cautiously pushes toward the rear entryway. Soon, the radicals launch an attack from the roofs, leading to a deadly gunfight between the two groups. During this, a rocket-propelled grenade strikes one of their jeeps, unfortunately killing two warriors. The revolutionaries then throw another grenade from the roofs, which explodes on a civilian vehicle. One of the soldiers, Tommy, is near the vehicle during the impact. Another soldier named Rico magnanimously dives onto Tommy to protect him. Sadly, this act of bravery leaves him severely injured with burns all over his body. Brandon rushes to check on Rico while the rest of the crew provides cover fire. He quickly moves the injured fighter into a nearby back alley to safeguard him from further attacks. Minutes later, another soldier named Preacher is struck by enemy gunfire, causing severe injuries to his neck and jaw. His best friend, Tommy, rushes to him, but Preacher sadly dies in his arms. Meanwhile, the rebels continue their barrage of gunfire, and Sergeant Steve chases one of them into a house. Brandon soon discovers that his longtime friend Steve has been injured, so he rushes inside the house to help him. There, he encounters several dead bodies with blood splattered all around. He helps a wounded Steve escape the house before the situation escalates further. The ambush results in the deaths of 3 US Army soldiers, while one is critically injured. Following this harrowing experience, Brandon and his fellow soldiers return to their small Texas town. They receive a warm welcome from the community, followed by a parade. However, the only thing truly worth celebrating is their survival. In the next scene, the soldiers attend a small welcome party at a local bar, surrounded by loved ones. A drunk Steve begins recounting the brutal battle they faced during the war. This obviously makes others uncomfortable, but he remains oblivious. He continues to share his desire to join the killing team and use it to avenge their fallen comrades by taking down the Iraqi rebels. That night, Brandon gets a call from Michelle, who is his childhood friend and now Steve's fiancée. Sensing her distress over the call, he quickly drives to their home and finds Steve digging a hole in the front yard. Brandon tries to talk to him, but he can't get through. Steve, lost in his thoughts, keeps digging as if they're on a mission in the war zone. It's clear he's having a psychological episode, likely due to PTSD from the war. Soon after, Brandon heads inside the house to talk to Michelle. To his amazement, he finds the place in chaos. Michelle then explains that Steve, in a drunken state, started believing that enemies were attacking him. He then stripped the entire house and started digging a hole outside. At that moment, Brandon notices a bruise on her face. She tearfully reveals that Steve accidentally struck her during his drunken outburst. As they talk, they notice Steve falling asleep in the hole outside, still grasping a weapon. Minutes later, Tommy arrives at their home, slamming his vehicle into a tree. Brandon then approaches him, and a visibly inebriated Tommy reveals that his wife, G.A., has thrown him out due to his drinking issues. He then confides in Brandon that he intends to stay at their lodge outside of town for a few days. Brandon, feeling sympathetic, suggests that the rest of the crew join him at the lodge to take some time off and relax. The following morning, the soldiers spend their time at the lodge drinking. Tommy entertains himself by destroying his wedding gifts while their friend Shorty reads the gift cards out loud. A hungover Steve is suddenly startled awake by the shots. The rest of the crew laughs as he stumbles out of the vehicle trunk in confusion and hurriedly gets dressed. They then observe quietly as Steve targets the gift from him and Michelle and destroys it. Later, Brandon pulls Steve aside for a private conversation and asks about the bruise on his face. Steve initially dismisses it and claims he walked into a door. However, Brandon sees through his lie and directly confronts him about hitting Michelle. Surprised, Steve admits that he doesn't remember the violent incident. He owns up to blacking out after their bar party and waking up suddenly in the trunk of Tommy's vehicle. Despite this, Brandon sternly warns him that such behavior can't be repeated. The next day, the crew returns to their army base. Brandon expects to be discharged from duty and encourages Tommy to lead the recruits. To his dismay, he receives orders to be deployed back to War Tower, Iraq. Brandon finds it difficult to accept his fate since he's still struggling to cope with the recent loss of his friends. Enraged, Brandon confronts his superior, Lieutenant Colonel Boot, about the order. Boot explains that the directive is based on the military's stop-loss policy. This policy requires soldiers to return to duty even after their active commitment has ended. Hearing this, Brandon openly criticizes the president, sparking a heated argument between him and Boot. Growing increasingly angry, Boot reminds Brandon of his duties as the crew leader and the need to follow orders. When he refuses to comply, Boot accuses him of disregarding a direct order from his superiors. He then orders his men to confine Brandon in military jail until his redeployment. Not long after, Brandon is accompanied by 2 fighters towards the jail, but he fiercely resists and manages to break free. He then drives away hurriedly from the base before stopping somewhere along the road to call Steve. He describes the entire ordeal and explains his decision to go AWOL after finding out he's been redeployed to Iraq. Steve cautions Brandon against this risky move and suggests seeking help from Boot. Brandon, however, reveals Boot's intention to punish him and insists on his plan to evade capture. Steve reassures Brandon and vows to help him find a solution. After returning home, Brandon finds the town sheriff waiting there. The sheriff informs Brandon's parents about his AWOL status and reveals that Boot has personally ordered a statewide search for him. The sheriff urges his parents to convince Brandon to surrender and take responsibility for his actions. After the sheriff leaves, Brandon sits down with his parents and Michelle and explains the whole situation. He then proposes taking the matter to a senator, but his father warns about the consequences of bypassing the chain of command. Undeterred, Brandon decides to drive to Washington, D.C. to address the issue himself. Due to surveillance by the military on their family, Michelle volunteers to drive with him. During their journey, they stop and book a hotel for the night. While Brandon relaxes by the pool, he suddenly envisions someone drowning and instinctively jumps in to save them, only to realize it was a hallucination brought on by the stress of their situation. The next morning, Brandon and Michelle hired as cops arrive looking for them. Meanwhile, Tommy begs Boot for another chance and vows to improve as a soldier. Steve then calls Brandon and informs him that he spent the night in jail trying to bail Tommy out of a DUI charge. He goes on to express frustration that Brandon, as their crew leader, is not present to handle such matters. Suddenly, Brandon tells Steve that he's going to Washington, D.C. to meet with the senator. Steve becomes even more irate, concerned for both his and Michelle's safety. Brandon then promises to drop her off before crossing the state line and reassures him that he'll return quickly. Later that day, Brandon and Michelle visit Preacher's family. Preacher was one of the soldiers under Brandon's command who was killed in the alley ambush. Brandon recounts the harrowing details of the ambush. Despite this, Preacher's parents express their gratitude that Brandon made the effort to visit them and check in. When Brandon and Michelle return to their car, they find that the window has been smashed. Brandon instructs Michelle to wait for him while he finds the culprits in a back alley. As he confronts the men, they attack Brandon, and one of them pulls a gun. Despite the odds, Brandon manages to disarm the assailant and forces all of them to kneel as if preparing to execute them. Just as Brandon is about to shoot, Michelle intervenes. She then convinces him to stop and leave with her, and Brandon reluctantly agrees. Subsequently, they get a nearby hotel where Brandon meets with another AWOL soldier. He reveals that the senator will be of no help and goes on to explain the struggles of being on the run. He then suggests a lawyer who can help him forge discharge documents. He also explains that Brandon could establish a new identity in Canada, which would significantly ease his life as a fugitive. The following morning, Steve visits them at the hotel. Having learned about their whereabouts from Michelle, he shows up in uniform to take Brandon back. He then informs him that he has made a deal with Boot. All charges against Brandon will be dropped if he returns to the base within 14 hours. Brandon becomes irritated, accusing Steve of making decisions behind his back. It is then revealed that Steve volunteered to return to Iraq and has re-enlisted himself. Michelle is enraged and questions Steve's commitment to their relationship and their plans to marry. He reassures her that they will still get married once he returns from his mission, but she remains silent, feeling hurt by Steve's decisions. Ultimately, she decides to end their relationship, unable to get over his betrayal and lack of communication. Soon after, the two men step outside where Steve reveals Tommy's ongoing struggle with alcoholism. He tries to persuade Brandon to return to duty with him, emphasizing that the crew only respects Brandon as their leader. However, Brandon remains steadfast in his decision and emphasizes the flawed nature of the war. Steve bluntly reminds him of the harsh reality. The senator won't help him because he's AWOL. Later on, Brandon calls the senator's office, but is informed that the senator won't meet with him since he's considered a fugitive now. Meanwhile, Steve finds Tommy, who is heavily intoxicated again. He insists he will see his wife J.I., but Steve tries to stop him. Tommy fires back, claiming he should not be offering advice on relationships, leaving Steve frustrated. Following this, Brandon and Michelle visit Rico, a soldier who bravely saved Tommy during the ambush in Iraq. Rico shares the devastating extent of his injuries. He has lost his right arm and leg, his vision, and suffers from severe facial burns due to the explosion. During their conversation, Rico describes the dire situation in the hospital, which is filled with the screams and nightmares of war veterans. Despite everything, Rico remains grateful that he survived and is no longer in the war zone. Later on, Brandon opens up to Michelle about the chaos and uncertainty of the battlefield. He goes on to share his guilt and trauma over the deaths of his fellow soldiers. He also confesses his guilt for accidentally taking the lives of several innocent Iraqi civilians. Soon after, Brandon contacts the lawyer recommended by the other AWOL soldier. The lawyer instructs him to meet at a diner with $11,000. Consequently, Brandon and Michelle sell their car and exchange it for a bike to gather the required amount. At the diner, the lawyer informs them that there's no turning back after this point. He then hands Brandon a new set of identification documents and gives him a phone number to call. The lawyer explains that once he calls the number, someone will arrange to pick him up at his new destination. Following this, Brandon calls his mother and learns the devastating news that Tommy has taken his own life at the Forest Lodge. During the funeral, Brandon visits Tommy's grave to pay his respects after everyone has left. Not long after, Steve also arrives and confronts Brandon. He blames himself for leaving and not being there for Tommy. They end up in a physical squabble as they both struggle with their grief and anger. The fight eventually ends with Brandon leaving the scene, leaving Steve to collapse in tears. A few days later, Brandon says goodbye to his father and leaves with his mother and Michelle. Together, they drive him towards the Mexican border to help him start a new life. As they approach the border, Brandon struggles with the realization that leaving everything he's known won't fix his inner turmoil. He decides against crossing into Mexico, believing he can't truly leave the war behind by escaping it. Later, Michelle joins Brandon's parents, and they arrive to say their farewells. The film concludes as Brandon, along with Steve and other soldiers, prepares to deploy to another war zone.